I'm going to read the Bible page for this morning. It starts at Mark chapter 11, verse 27. And it goes through to chapter 12, verse 12. They arrived in Jerusalem, and while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders came to him. "By what authority are you doing these things?" they asked. "And who gave you authority to do this?" Jesus replied, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you, by what authority am I doing these things? John's baptism, was it from heaven or from human origin? Tell me." They discussed this among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin," they feared the people, for everyone held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We don't know." Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you. By what authority am I doing these things?" Jesus then began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. But they seized him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Then he sent another servant to them. They struck this man on the head and treated him shamefully. He sent still another, and that one they killed. He sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. He had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, "They will respect my son." But the tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Haven't you read this passage of Scripture? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvellous in our eyes. Then the chief priest, the teachers of the law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him, because they knew he had spoken a parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away.
Good morning, everyone. Today, our passage starts with Jesus and the disciples. They're going back to the temple courtyard. The chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders asked Jesus to explain himself. "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you the authority to do this?" Last week, we saw Jesus. He was clearing out the temple. He cursed the fig tree, and before that, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And all of it was quite dramatic. And last week, Andrew helpfully took us through all of that last week and explained what was going on. And here we are, the chief priests and the teachers of the law have heard about it in verse 18. So that gives us some context for why they're saying down in verse 28, "By what authority are you doing these things?" They want to know, who do you think you are? If someone came in here and started flipping chairs, tables, the music equipment, yelling at people to get out, and then you saw them the next day, you would be like, what are you doing? Why did you do that? Who do you think you are? So on the one hand, it's a pretty reasonable question. But on the other hand, these guys have been witness to many of the events of the book of Mark. Back in Mark chapter 2, they saw Jesus claim to be God and then back it up with a miracle. They saw Jesus heal a man with a crippled hand, all the way back in chapter 3, and it says then that they made plans to kill Jesus. Having seen his miracles, they accuse him of having the power of Beelzebul. How many signs do these guys need to know that he really is from God? Jesus knows that when they're asking him this question, they're trying to trap him. Was there any answer that Jesus could give that they would be satisfied with, that would make them believe? As soon as he opens his mouth, they're out to disagree with him, to find fault with what he's saying. So he doesn't answer their question directly. He gives them their own question back. John's baptism, was it from God or from humans? Jesus is talking about not just John's baptism, but his whole ministry. Was John a messenger from God, or was he merely a human messenger? It's a clever question. If they say that John's ministry came from God, then Jesus will challenge them and say, why didn't you listen to John? If they say what they really think, which is that John's authority was human, well, they're afraid of the crowd. They're afraid the crowd will turn on them. We're told in verse 32 that they're afraid of the people. Everyone believed that John really was a prophet. And that's what the common perception of John was. We're going to look at a Jewish historian from the first century. This guy's name is Josephus. He died about the year 100. That is 70 years after these events in Mark. He wrote a history about the Jews, and there's lots of details about things around the time of Jesus, both before and after. He doesn't say a whole lot about Jesus, but he does make a few mentions of John the Baptist. It's going to come up on the projector, and we're going to read what he wrote. And the point of this is to show you what people thought of John. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God as a just punishment of what Herod had done against he who was called John the Baptist. For Herod had killed this good man who had commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, righteousness towards one another, and piety towards God. For only thus, in John's opinion, would the baptism he administered be acceptable to God. Namely, if they used it to obtain not pardon for some sins, but rather cleansing of their bodies, inasmuch as it was taken for granted that their souls had already been purified by justice. Now, many people came in crowds to him, for they were greatly moved by his words. Herod, who feared the great influence that John had over the masses, might put them into his power and enable him to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything that he should advise. Herod thought it best to put him to death. In this way, he might prevent any mischief that John might cause and not bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it would be too late. Accordingly, John was sent as a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I already mentioned, and was put to death. Now the Jews thought that the destruction of his army was sent as a punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure with him. It's quite interesting. It's apart from the cool part that this is a historically reliable document, it shows that what the Jewish people of the time felt about John the Baptist. He was held in high esteem by the crowds, by the people, but not by the leaders. The leaders of Israel didn't like John the Baptist. Why? There's two reasons I can think of. Firstly, he didn't like them. He was critical of them. Listen to this from Matthew chapter 3. But when John saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to where he was baptizing, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath?" John was critical of them. He did not like them. And the second reason that John the Baptist, they didn't like John, he was preparing the way for Jesus. And Jesus himself was critical of these leaders. Believing that John was from God meant to believe in the one he was pointing to. The Israelite leaders wanted none of John and none of Jesus. So when Jesus asked them the question, where was John's baptism from? If they were being honest, they would have said from human origin. But they can't admit this because of the crowd. The crowd holds John as a prophet from God. So they give the answer, we don't know. But Jesus isn't fooled. His answer is, then I won't tell you. He knows that they really know. They are doing everything they can to trap Jesus, to trick him, to catch him in his words. And Jesus, being who he is, knows what they're up to. He knows how to avoid being caught by them until the time is right. He has a mission. His mission is to die, only when the time is right. He will not back down when the right time comes, but only then. Until then, he will evade their traps. He will go willingly when the time is right. I mean, even if they had answered Jesus' question, could Jesus have said anything that would convince them that he was from God? They have said that they couldn't work out if John's authority was from God or from human authority. So what right do they have to question Jesus' authority? They just prove they don't have that right to judge Jesus. Moving on to the second part of our passage, I'll tell you a story about Bob. He grew up in Forbes and he wanted to set up his own nightclub. So he renovates, he decorates, he hires musicians, cooks, other staff. He includes seating, a dance floor, VIP rooms, trendy bars. He gets a wood-fired pizza oven installed. He spares no expense. He hires 2 brothers who go into business with him. He appoints the managers of the store before heading off on an extended holiday. Whilst on holidays in New Zealand, he loves the place so much that he buys a house and decides to live there. After some time, he notices that he has not been earning any income from his business venture. So he sends his old friend round on the brothers to check in. They laugh at him. He hires lawyers who send letters, but nothing happens. The lawyers visit the club, but they're forcibly removed. Debt collectors are called in. They're beaten up by the club bouncers. One's even killed. Horrified by all this, he sends his son, hoping to clear up all the matters of disagreement. The 2 brothers see him coming and order their goons to kill him. Bob takes the matter to the police, who force out the brothers. They are killed for their crimes, and Bob appoints new trustworthy managers. That's just me retelling the story as a modern-day story. Some of the details are changed, of course, but the general gist of it's still there. What's your reaction to the story? Do you get a bit shocked by the violence? The violence from the brothers, but also from Bob? Retelling the story in a modern way, it makes it a bit more engaging, but you can lose some of the meaning when you translate it like that. Let's look back at the original story Jesus told. Chapter 12, verse 1. Jesus began to speak to them in parables. That is, Jesus is making up a story, an earthly story that has a deeper hidden meaning. In this story, there's a man who plants a vineyard. He puts a wall around it. He dug a pit for the winepress and built a watchtower. And all these things are common features for a vineyard in Jesus' time. A vineyard grows grapes. What do you do with grapes? You eat them, but you also turn them into wine. The wall is for keeping out animals who will wreck the grapes and keeping out thieves who will steal the grapes. The winepress is for turning the grapes into wine. And the watchtower has 2 purposes. One's to provide shelter for the workers, and it also helps to keep watch over the vine from thieves. In other words, this man who set up the vineyard has done everything you need to run a successful operation. He's taken care of all the setup costs. And then he rents out the vineyard to some farmers, and he moves to another place. And apparently this was not an unusual practice to rent out your farm to someone else to work. At harvest time, he sends a servant to the tenants to collect from them the fruit of the vineyard. The owner knows that he set up the vineyard well, so that come harvest time, there should be a crop. He sent someone to go and collect. And the fruit of the vineyard was probably wine, but it could have been the grapes. the servant sees him. They beat him up and send him away empty-handed. And the parable's just taken a dramatic turn. Our story about farming has just become violent. Why did they refuse to hand over some of the fruit? Wasn't this part of their agreement? The story doesn't explain. And disputes may have been common between landowners and tenants. I don't know how it came to violence. They refused to give anything. In verse 4, the owner sends another servant to collect. This one they hit on the head and treat him shamefully. So it's not just violence now, but humiliation. The owner sends a third servant, and him they kill. This is not going well. The owner seems like a bit of an optimist. Despite all the evidence, he still believes the renters will do what's right, because he keeps sending more. Some of them they beat, others they kill. And he's down to only his son, whom he loves, and he sends him, saying, surely they'll respect my son. It seems a bit naive that the owner would consider sending his son after all that's happened. He's seen what they've done to all the servants. Surely he knows what will happen. Do the tenants respect him? No. They say to each other, this guy's the heir. If we kill him and then we get the inheritance, we'll get the inheritance, it'll all be ours. So they take the son, they kill him, and they throw him out of the vineyard. The owner's son is killed. What's the owner going to do? He'll come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. And really, it seems only fair in the circumstances. You do wonder, why didn't the owner do something about it sooner? Why did he let it get to that stage? And we said earlier that parables are stories that contain a hidden meaning. So let's look at some of these characters and see who they represent. Now, if you are below the age of 20, this is your chance to shine. I'll shout you a drink after church if you can get this question right, or these questions right. There's about 5 or 6 questions. They start easy and they get harder. First one. Who does the son represent in the story? God. Kyle, you get a drink. No, actually, it's not God. I got it wrong, sorry. Not God. Fletcher. Jesus, thank you. All right, Kyle, this one's for you. Who does the owner represent? God, thank you. Okay, so the son is Jesus, the owner is God. Now it's getting harder. 3 more questions. These are a bit harder, these ones. Who are the renters and the tenants in the story? Taryn. Not Satan. Alex, you're too old. Izzy. No, it's not us sinners. Fletcher, what do you reckon? Yeah. Pretty close. It's the leaders, okay? It's the leaders of Israel. The farmers and the tenants are the leaders of Israel. You can give one of your extra ones to someone else. All right, another one. In the story, who are the servants that the owner sends and they get beaten up and killed? Who are they? Not us. Prophets. Thank you, Izzy. Lexi. Izzy's over there. It's hard to think about what you're saying and remember people's names. All right, one more. Who or what does the vineyard represent? Not the world. Hallie, what'd you say? Heaven, not heaven. Is he? Yeah, it represents God's people. So it's Christians now, or in that time it was the Jews, Israel. Righto, so let's go over those again. The son is Jesus. The owner is God. The tenants are the leaders of Israel. The servants are the prophets. And the vineyard represents God's people. All right, thanks all you guys for your help. So God has set up his vineyard. That is Israel. And he gave it to the leaders of Israel. He expected fruit from the crop. But when he sent his prophets to collect the fruit, they were rejected, beaten and killed. And finally, God sent Israel his son, Jesus. And him they treat worst of all, and they kill him. And God is going to come and he's going to kill the leaders of Israel and hand his people over to more worthy leaders. And as we've already said, this is pretty dramatic and it's violent. but also something else. I said that parables have a hidden meaning and it can be hard for outsiders to understand. But this parable isn't that hard to understand, even for people who are outside God's kingdom. We've just identified all the characters, and the chief priests, who are against Jesus, they're not in God's kingdom, they understand what this parable's saying, and it's that it's against them. It says in verse 12 that they looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. Now, I've just said that that's what those things are, but how can we be sure that that's what the meaning is? That, that Israel's the vineyard and God's the owner. Well, Cody read it for us earlier at the start of the service, Isaiah chapter 5. This is going to come up in the projector. This is a really similar story to the one Jesus just told. So Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 to 4. I will sing for the one I love, a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now, you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. So, if we go down to verse 7, I think there's one more. Is there one more, Josh? Yeah, thanks. Oh, there's a few more, sorry. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Next one. And then we're skipping to verse 7. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines that he delighted in. He looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. So, the vineyard was made by God, but the vineyard is God's people, the nation of Israel. Here in Isaiah and in Mark, God is the one who built it. And in both cases, he looks for fruit. He looks for grapes or wine. The vineyard represents God's people. In Isaiah, God's anger is directed at the vineyard itself. He says, you should have produced good fruit, but you're only making rotten fruit. God was angry at the nation. But in our story with Jesus, in Mark, the anger is directed at the farmers who managed the vineyard. Who are those people who were responsible for tending the vine? The leaders of Israel, the chief priests and the scribes, the people that Jesus is talking to directly. And we read that the owner was sending his son. And we've already established that God is the owner, so it's not hard to say then that the son is Jesus. Would the people listening to Jesus' story have recognized that Jesus was the son in the story? Possibly. Probably. We know that Jesus is God's son. We've seen several times in the book of Mark that Jesus is called the Son. At his baptism, God called him his son. The evil spirits always recognize who Jesus is. And what's more, the leaders of the parable know that this was directed at them. So I think it's fair to say they knew that Jesus was calling himself the owner's son. Just back one chapter, they wanted to kill Jesus. It shows us again that Jesus knows his future. He knows his fate. He knows what's going to happen to him soon. He's predicted his arrest, his suffering, and his crucifixion multiple times. And we know that this is coming to Jesus in just a few days in the story. Back in the parable, who are the servants who appear before the Son? These are the prophets that God sent to his people. John the Baptist is the most recent example. He was arrested and killed. But other prophets in the Old Testament were treated awfully by the very people of God. It showed how wicked the leaders of God's people have been for years, for generations. Jesus is showing the true nature of the religious leaders, how they take what isn't theirs. They commit violence to keep it. What is the owner of the vineyard going to do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. The owner will not tolerate the evil of his tenants, and so he kills them and hands it over. God will not let this injustice continue. He will bring his rightful anger to bear on these evil leaders. He will give over the position of leadership to new and better farmers. And you can even see this throughout the Old Testament. We can see through Israel's history how God worked to establish his vineyard, just like in the parable. In the parable, the owner planted a vineyard. In the Old Testament, God made his promises to Abraham. In the parable, the owner built a wall around his vineyard. God rescued his people from Egypt. The owner dug a winepress, and God gave the law to the Israelites in the desert. The owner built a watchtower. God conquered the promised land. The owner appointed tenants to farm the land. God appointed judges, priests, prophets, and kings. The tenants refused to give the owner what is rightfully his. The kings of Israel led them astray, worshipping other gods and killing the prophets. The owner sent his son. God sent Jesus to Israel. What will happen to the leaders who reject God's son? They'll be killed, and their power will be taken away from them. This parable explains the consequences of rejecting God's Messiah, his king. This story's direct application is to those who were present with Jesus at the time. They were there. He was talking to them, to those leaders. They were the ones who went on to kill Jesus. And he speaks against them. You can see it in verse 12. But does this story have any use to us now, any relevance? Can it be applied to us? Yes, sort of. You can, but you have to be careful not to take it too far. For example, in the year 1500, the church in Europe was one church. That is, you didn't have denominations like we do now, such as Anglican, Baptist, Catholic, Presbyterian. You just had the church. However, the leaders of the church were doing and teaching things that were contradictory to what Jesus taught. One of the most obvious was these things called indulgences. It's going to come up on the slide. These were little certificates that the church would give you to reduce your punishment for sin. If people had done wrong, they could pay some money or do some action, and they would get this certificate to reduce their penalty. And you could even pay money to get an indulgence on behalf of somebody who'd already died to reduce their punishment. In the year 1517, Martin Luther, there's a photo of him coming up, or painting, he proposed a discussion about these indulgences and said, well, they're being abused. We need to change how we do them. His ideas were rejected. He was kicked out of the church and they tried to kill him. And this started the Protestant Reformation, where the church flourished as people understood the message of grace for many for the first time. And almost all Christian denominations that exist today, including Baptists, can trace their origins to this time. You can see in this church history the parallels to Jesus' story. God and Jesus established their vineyard, the church. They did everything that was needed. Jesus paid the price for sin. God gave us everything we need to run the church. He gave us apostles and he gave us the books of the New Testament. But then over time, the leaders of the church did not tend the vineyard as they should. They did not give honor to God. And then the work of the vineyard was given over to more reliable leaders. Different denominations were formed, returning to God's message. And if you know your history of this time, you'll know that there were men before Luther who tried to bring the gospel and reform the church. But like the servants in the parable, they were arrested and they were killed for their words. People like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. However, this story of church history doesn't fit the parable in every way. The part of the story where the son comes in and is killed by the owners is clearly about Jesus, and there is no modern day parallel with him. So you've got to be careful about saying that this parable's about different events in history, because ultimately it's about the events in Jesus' day. But you can see the similarities in them. Does this story, this parable, have any relevance for us? We believe the Bible, the New Testament, it was written nearly 2,000 years ago, was about the events of then, but that according to 2 Timothy, all scripture is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. So what can we learn from this passage? What's it got to do with us? How does it teach us? How does it train us? How does it rebuke us? One application you could draw is about who owns the church. I could ask you, who owns Forbes Baptist Church? You might say, well, it's the organisation, the legal entity. Forbes Baptist Church is owned by Forbes Baptist Church. But someone else might say, no, it's the people who go to the church. They're the ones who own it. But in our parable, who owns the vineyard? God. Do the vines own the vineyard? Do the workers own the vineyard? No. The owner of the vineyard is God. He's the owner. And the owner of our church is God. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to you or our pastor who's coming soon. This is Jesus' church. In another way, you could argue that the leaders of the church are like the renters in the story. When the owner, God, comes to collect the fruit of the vine, what does that mean? What does it look like for God to come and collect what's his? Are our leaders, the sort of church leaders, are they the sort of workers who beat up God's messengers? Or are they the kind who give the fruit to the true owner? I am not saying that the leaders of our church are like the chief priests. They rejected Jesus, they killed Jesus and his messengers. Our leaders of our church are not like that. I'm trying to get you thinking, what would it look like for someone who is a leader of the church to get it so wrong that they're fighting against God's plans, fighting against God's Son? Think back again to Martin Luther. At the time, the leaders of the Catholic Church, and do you know what they did? They killed people over this. They thought that they were on God's side. They thought that God was on their side. How could they get it so wrong? In Jesus' day, how could the chief priests, the leaders of God's people, reject God's Son? In verse 10 and 11 in the passage, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Jesus is quoting from Psalm 118. And in Psalm 118, the singer is crying out to God. He asks God to save him in his distress. But Jesus is taking these two verses and saying it applies to him, saying that it's relevant to his situation then and there. The builders are the chief priests. The stone is Jesus. The chief priests have rejected Jesus and his message, yet Jesus has become the cornerstone. What's a cornerstone? There's a couple of ideas about what a cornerstone is. Some people say it's the very first foundation stone of a building. It's placed in the corner, and the other stones of the building are placed in reference to it. So where you place the cornerstone determines the whole structure and shape of the building. Another idea of what the cornerstone means is that it's the final piece of the structure, that it holds everything together and gives it completeness. I think it's the latter, but I'm not sure. The Jewish people believe that this message from Psalm 118 was referring to the Messiah, and Jesus confirms it, that it's talking about him. He is claiming that he is that stone, the cornerstone, the most important part of a building that completes it. The leaders of Israel know this. They know it's a reference to the Messiah. They know that Jesus is claiming this about himself. And that is why, again, in verse 12, they want to arrest him. They know he is talking against them. By their desire to arrest and kill Jesus, they are proving that they are the tenants in the story. How could God's leaders get it so wrong? The stone that the builders rejected has become the most important stone of all. The Lord has done it. It is wonderful in our eyes. The chief priests loved their position of authority. They loved placing burdens and rituals on people, making God difficult to access, making the people feel guilty when they don't follow him. Jesus came along and shows that he's a friend to sinners, that God doesn't want rituals. Jesus was showing that you could not be saved on your own merits. No matter the extent of your law keeping, you could not earn your way to God. The chief priests hated this. It contradicted what they taught and encouraged. It showed that they weren't necessary. The stone the builders rejected has become the most important stone. In Martin Luther's day, the church was teaching that you could literally buy your way out of punishment. Luther powerfully taught that salvation was a free gift of God. It's impossible to buy your salvation because Christ has already paid for it. And the leaders of the church at the time hated this because it contradicted what they were teaching. It lessened their power they held over their congregations. It exposed their greed. It showed them for who they are. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. As I finish up, I just want to ask some questions for reflection. As a church, are there any practices or formalities that we do in our services that prevent people from coming to Christ? Are there any burdens that we place on others that Jesus himself would not place? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it's marvelous in our eyes. Jesus is that stone. His work on the cross is the cornerstone. It is fundamental to what it means to be a Christian. It's a gift from God. What a God we follow. Amen.
Brings our service to a close today. We do challenge everyone to, as we gather together in fellowship over coffee and tea, that we do discuss the words and things that we hear. Where have we been rebuked? Where have we been encouraged? Where have we seen Jesus more clearly, and what makes us worship him all the more? We'll finish with one more reading of that verse, chapter 12, verse 10. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Amen.